The wind off the Svalbard coastline didn't just bite, it sought to hollow out the bone, a predatory chill that reduced the concept of civilization to a flickering, distant memory. Dae-hyun stood on the edge of a rusted satellite gantry, his maroon overcoat snapping like a battle flag against the blinding white of the Arctic shelf. The silver of his hair was indistinguishable from the frost-rimed steel of the station. He was thousands of miles from the boardroom in Seoul, yet he had never felt more like a man on a precipice. In his gloved hand, he gripped the obsidian coin, the invitation that had appeared in his private safe, bypassing sensors that were supposed to be impenetrable. There were no guards here, no tactical teams, only the vast, indifferent silence of the ice. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a bruised indigo shadow across the tundra, a single light flickered to life inside the belly of the decommissioned bunker. Dae-hyun descended into the depths, the sound of his boots on the metal rungs echoing like a countdown. At the bottom of the shaft, the air changed. It was no longer frozen. It was filtered, recycled, and pressurized. The bunker had been transformed into a vault of glass and obsidian, a mirror of the world he and Zara had been trying to build, but on a scale that felt ancient and terrifying. At the center of the room sat a woman whose skin was the color of parchment and whose eyes held the weary weight of centuries. She was the first of the 12, the keeper of the vault. "The monster of Seoul has traveled quite far to find a seat he doesn't yet understand," she said, her voice a dry rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the room. She didn't look at his face, she looked at the maroon fabric of his sleeve. "You wear the color of blood as if it were a badge of honor. But at the high table, blood is merely a currency, and yours, Mr. Han, is currently in high demand." Dae-hyun didn't flinch. He walked to the center of the room, the obsidian coin clicking as he placed it on a table made of solid, dark light. "I didn't come here to trade, and I didn't come here for an audience. I came to see the face of the hand that tried to audit my life." The woman laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. "The consulate was a nursery, Dae-hyun, a test to see if you and the architect were worth the energy of a formal introduction. You destroyed them, which was expected. But, can you survive the silence that follows? The high table doesn't manage companies. We manage the species. We decide which dreams become reality, and which ones are deleted at the source." She stood, her movements fluid and hauntingly precise. Behind her, a panoramic screen flickered to life, showing a live feed of the penthouse in Seoul. Dae-hyun saw Zara working in her command center, and more importantly, he saw Haru sitting on the floor, staring directly into a hidden camera lens with an expression of calm, terrifying recognition. "The boy is already speaking to us," the keeper whispered. "He doesn't need a coin. He is the coin. If you want to protect him, you won't do it with a shipping fleet or a digital firewall. You will do it by taking the seat that has been vacated. The obsidian throne is waiting. But it requires a sacrifice that your maroon suit cannot hide." Dae-hyun looked at the screen, at his son's unblinking eyes, and felt the Arctic cold finally reach his heart. He wasn't at the edge of the world. He was at the beginning of a new one. The trial had moved from the streets to the stars, and the invitation wasn't a choice. It was a summons to the real war. The stillness of the Seoul penthouse had taken on a new, crystalline frequency, a silence that felt less like peace and more like the breath held before a lightning strike. Haru was 7 now, a lean shadow of a boy whose presence seemed to warp the very air around him. He sat in the center of Zara's sanctuary, the architect's inner sanctum where data flowed in a constant bioluminescent tide across the walls. He wasn't playing with the intricate mechanical watches of his toddlerhood anymore. He was playing with the heartbeat of the world. Zara stood by the observation deck, her reflection in the glass, a ghost of the woman she had been. Her emerald eyes were fixed on the master console, where her most advanced predictive algorithms, the ones that managed the Han Group's global logistics and counterintelligence, were being systematically outpaced. It wasn't a breach from an external hacker or a glitch in the code. It was Haru. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor, a single holographic interface hovering before him. He wasn't typing. His fingers moved through the air in fluid, almost musical arcs, as if he were plucking strings only he could see. He was rerouting a global supply chain in real time, anticipating a market crash in the Mediterranean 3 days before Zara's AI had even flagged the volatility. It wasn't logic. It was synthetic intuition, a terrifying fusion of human instinct and the cold, lightning-fast processing of a machine. Haru, Zara said, her voice a low, cautious chime that masked the tremor in her heart. You've bypassed the third-layer firewall again. You know that's the perimeter for the high table's surveillance. The boy didn't look up immediately. His eyes, a haunting mirror of his father's intensity but filled with a strange, silvery light, remained fixed on a cluster of collapsing data points. The firewall is slow, Mother. It looks for patterns that already exist, but the world doesn't move in patterns anymore. It moves in breaks. He made a sharp flicking motion with his wrist. Takana and $1 billion in digital assets shifted from a volatile European hedge fund into a dormant Han shell company. I'm not breaking the system. I'm just showing it where it's already broken. Dae-hyun entered the room, the deep maroon of his silk shirt looking like a shadow against the stark white of the walls. He had just returned from the Arctic, the cold of the Svalbard bunker still clinging to his skin. He stopped beside Zara, his hand resting on her shoulder, feeling the tension radiating through her frame. They both watched their son, the heir to a bloodline of monsters and architects, as he dismantled the most complex financial structures on the planet with the effortless boredom of a child solving a jigsaw puzzle. He's not just calculating, Zara whispered to Dae-hyun, her voice barely audible over the hum of the processors. He's feeling the flow of the global network. He knew the Tokyo exchange would dip because of a humidity spike in the Brazilian rainforest. He's seeing connections that shouldn't exist. Dae-hyun looked at his son and saw the keepers, warning manifesting in flesh and blood. The High Table didn't want the Han Group's ships. They wanted the mind that could steer them through the chaos of the coming century. Haru wasn't just a prodigy. He was a bridge to a type of power that rendered traditional sovereignty obsolete. Haru finally looked up, his expression chillingly calm. Father, the man you met in the ice, the one who gave you the coin, she's trying to call you back, but she's using an old frequency. He smiled, a small, knowing expression that made him look ancient. I've changed the locks. If they want to talk to us now, they have to ask me first. The gambit was set. The 7-year-old hadn't just protected his family. He had effectively hijacked the communication lines of the world's most powerful secret society. As the monitors turned a deep warning crimson, Dae-hyun realized that the sacrifice the High Table demanded wasn't his life. It was the realization that he was no longer the most dangerous person in the room. The digital architecture of the old world was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, made of glass and copper. Zara understood this better than anyone as she stood in the subterranean heart of the Han Group's secondary research facility. Above her, the city of Seoul hummed with the frantic energy of 1 billion connected devices. But down here, in a room shielded by 3 meters of lead-lined concrete, the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the cooling fans. She was initiating Project Ethelgard. It was her masterpiece, a private satellite-based internet cluster that would exist in the high vacuum silence of low Earth orbit, far beyond the jurisdiction of any terrestrial government or the prying eyes of the High Table. The cloud is a lie, Dae-hyun, Zara said, her voice echoing in the sterile chamber. She was dressed in a dark, midnight blue tactical suit, her hair pulled back with surgical severity. The internet we know is a shared dream monitored by predators. If we keep the Han legacy on the public grid, they will eventually find a way to edit us out of existence. Ethelgard is different. It's a decentralized sovereign network. It doesn't rely on cables under the sea or servers in Virginia. It lives on a swarm of 60 microsatellites we've spent the last 6 months launching under the guise of weather monitoring hardware. Dae-hyun stood by the central pillar, his maroon suit jacket draped over his arm, his eyes reflecting the cascading streams of gold data on the panoramic displays. "You're building a digital nation-state," he observed. "A territory with no borders, no embassies, and no laws but yours." "Laws that Haru is already rewriting," Zara countered, her fingers flying across the holographic interface as she began the final synchronization. The weight of Project Ethelgard was immense. It was intended to be a vault for the synthetic intuition their son was developing, a place where his mind could expand without being harvested by the hegemon. Zara had designed the core architecture to be self-healing. If one satellite was compromised or shot down, the data would simply migrate and re-encrypt across the rest of the swarm. It was a ghost in the machine, a silent sentinel that would ensure the Han family remained untouchable in the coming conflict. As the synchronization bar hit 90%, the room's lighting flickered, a sudden surge of power that made the air smell of scorched ozone. On the primary monitor, a map of the globe appeared, dotted with 60 blinking white lights, their private constellation. Zara felt a surge of triumph, but it was tempered by the chilling realization of what they had just done. By separating themselves from the world's infrastructure, they were declaring total independence. They weren't just a family anymore. They were a sovereign entity that answered to no one. "Once the bridge is closed," Zara whispered, her hand hovering over the execute command, "we won't be able to turn back. We'll be living in a world of our own making. Alone in the dark." Dae-hyun moved to her side, his hand covering hers on the console. His silver hair caught the blue light of the satellites, and for a moment, he looked like a god watching over a new creation. "We were always alone, Zara. The only difference is that now we have the high ground." The final sequence initiated. In the silence of space, 60 tiny machines adjusted their solar panels, turning their sensors inward toward a private frequency. Ethelgard was live. The Han legacy had left the Earth, leaving the high table to claw at the empty air they had left behind. But as the network stabilized, a single, each unauthorized line of code flickered at the bottom of the screen, a small, silver icon of a dragon. Haru had already found his way in. He wasn't just using the network, he was inhabiting it, his mind drifting through the satellites like a spirit through a cathedral. The architect had built the house, but the prodigy had already claimed the throne. The morning sun over Seoul did not bring warmth. It brought a shimmering, unnatural haze that hung over the Han group's spire like a veil of diamond dust. It began as a microscopic tremor in the air, a faint metallic scent that Zara's sensors initially dismissed as urban pollution. But as the haze settled onto the glass of the penthouse, the transparency didn't just cloud, it began to dissolve. This was the blood-dimmed tide, a masterstroke of molecular warfare launched by a rival sovereign who viewed the Han's digital independence as an evolutionary threat. It was a gray goo attack, millions of self-replicating nanobots designed to consume organic and inorganic matter alike, turning the world into a featureless silver sludge. "Atmospheric breach in Sector 4, Zara's voice rang out, sharp and devoid of its usual melodic rhythm. She didn't look at the monitors. She looked at her own hand, where a single speck of silver dust had landed. The skin beneath it didn't redden. It simply vanished, replaced by a tiny, spreading patch of chrome. "Dae-hyun, don't touch the glass. It's not smoke. It's a swarm." Dae-hyun moved with the fluid lethality of a man who had spent his life dodging bullets, only to find himself facing an enemy he couldn't hit. He wore a deep maroon turtleneck under a structured coat, the dark fabric providing a stark contrast to the encroaching silver rot. He snatched a heavy obsidian vase from a pedestal and hurled it at the window. The stone didn't shatter the glass, it was consumed by it, the nanobot stripping the molecules of the vase in midair and using the mass to replicate. The tide was growing, a silent, ravenous wave of silver foam that began to pour through the ventilation shafts. "It's eating the insulation," Daehyun rasped, his eyes darting to the corner where Haru stood. "Zara, the Ethelgard protocol. Can the satellites jam the frequency?" "They're too high," Zara cried, on her fingers dancing over a holographic interface that was already beginning to flicker and distort as the nanobots reached the processors. "The swarm is autonomous. It's not being steered. It's just programmed to feed until there's nothing left but Han-shaped dust." Haru, however, did not run. He stood in the center of the room, his eyes wide and reflecting the silver shimmer of the air. To the boy, the tide wasn't a monster, it was a logic puzzle. He reached out a hand not to touch the swarm, but to beckon it. The synthetic intuition that had hijacked global markets now reached into the microscopic architecture of the machines. His mind, linked to the Ethelgard satellites via a neural bridge Zara hadn't even finished testing, began to broadcast a counter-command. "Stop," Haru whispered, the word barely a breath. The effect was instantaneous. The silver foam, which had been seconds away from touching Daehyun's boots, froze. The humming sound of a billion tiny machines vibrating in unison shifted from a low growl to a high-pitched whine. The boy wasn't jamming the signal. He was rewriting the nanobot's basic directives. He was telling the machines that they were already full. A bead of sweat rolled down Haru's temple, turning into a silver droplet as it hit the floor. The effort was immense, his small frame trembling under the weight of controlling a molecular army. Slowly, the silver tide began to recede, the nanobots clumping together into inert, heavy balls of leaden slag that fell harmlessly to the carpet. The threat was neutralized, but the cost was etched into the boy's pale face. Daehyun lunged forward, he catching his son before he hit the ground. He looked at the ruined penthouse, the dissolved walls, the scorched air, and then at the silver dust still sparkling on his maroon sleeve. The rival sovereign hadn't just tried to kill them. They had forced the Han family to reveal their greatest weapon. Haru wasn't just an heir anymore. He was a biological EMP. "They know now," Zara said, her voice trembling as she knelt beside them. "They know what he can do. The high table won't send machines next time. They'll come themselves." Daehyun looked at his son's closed eyes, his jaw tightening. The war had moved from the digital to the molecular, and the glass continent was already beginning to melt. The exodus from Seoul was not a retreat. It was an ascension. As the silver dust of the nanotech attack was still being scrubbed from the atmosphere by Zara's containment drones, the family crossed the threshold of the glass citadel. Located in a neutral free zone carved out of the rocky coast of the Adriatic, the citadel was a miracle of brutalist architecture and translucent defiance. It was a vertical fortress, a self-sustaining spire that generated its own power, recycled its own water, and existed entirely outside the jurisdiction of any flag or bank. It was the physical anchor for Project Ethelgard, a monument to the fact that the Han family had finally stepped off the map of the world. Daehyun stood on the observation deck, 80 stories above the crashing surf. He wore a structured maroon suit with silver thread woven into the lapels, a conductor for the Citadel's internal biometric sensors. The building was alive, an extension of his own nervous system. Every footstep he took was tracked by the synthetic intuition of the building's core, which adjusted the oxygen levels and light to match his heart rate. He looked out over the free zone, a glittering city of refugees and high-stakes gamblers that had sprung up in the shadow of the citadel. Down there, people traded in secrets and survival. Up here, he traded in destiny. "The sovereigns think they can starve us out," Zara said, her voice echoing through the vast open-plan command center that occupied the top 3 floors. She was illuminated by the blue glow of a holographic map showing the Citadel's orbital link to the Ethelgard satellites. "But we are entirely decoupled. We grow our own food in the hydro farms on the lower levels. We have enough air and energy to last a century of siege. We have built a world within a world. She paused, her emerald eyes narrowing as she monitored the perimeter. The citadel wasn't just a home, it was a weapon. The exterior glass was reinforced with a lattice of carbon nanotubes, capable of refracting laser fire or dispersing the kinetic energy of a missile strike. Underneath the sleek aesthetic was a layer of electronic warfare suites that could black out an entire city block if a hostile signature drew too close. It was the ultimate glass citadel, beautiful, transparent, and completely lethal to anyone who tried to break it. Haru sat in a sunken lounge area, his small hands moving through a swarm of light. He was no longer just playing with data. He was managing the Citadel's immune system. Since the nanotech attack, his connection to the machines had deepened into something intimate and strange. He didn't need a keyboard. The building responded to his thoughts. When he felt a moment of frustration, the glass tinted darker. When he was calm, the air grew cooler. He was the ghost in the heart of the tower, the spirit of the machine that kept them all alive. "Father," Haru said, without turning around. "The high table is testing the perimeter, not with ships, with whispers." Dae-hyun walked to his son's side, looking at the display. A series of encrypted signals were bouncing off the citadel's outer shell. Requests for parley, bribe offers, and veiled threats, all encoded in the language of the 12. The sovereigns were realizing that the Han family couldn't be deleted or consumed. They were a sovereign island in a sea of controlled chaos. "Let them whisper," Dae-hyun replied, his voice a low, rhythmic growl. "They're realizing that the citadel isn't a cage to keep us in. It's a lighthouse, to show them where the old world ends." But as he looked at Zara, he saw the shadow of the architect's burden in the lines of her face. The citadel was perfect, but perfection was its own kind of prison. They were safe, but they were isolated, and the more they fortified their home, the more they realized that the real battle wouldn't be fought with walls. It would be fought in the one place the glass couldn't protect. The connection between a mother, a father, and a son who was becoming something the world had never seen before. The hum of the glass citadel was usually a symphony of perfect efficiency, a low-frequency vibration that signaled the seamless integration of Zara's code and Haru's intuition. But tonight, the air felt jagged. Zara sat in the darkness of the primary terminal, her face illuminated by the flickering data streams of Project Ethelgard. For weeks, she had been playing a high-stakes game of digital chess with the hegemon, the high table's ghost entity, and for weeks, she had been losing. Every trap she set was evaded before it sprang. Every encryption she devised was cracked, as if the hegemon already held the key. It was a statistical impossibility, a blind spot in her own genius that was starting to feel like a betrayal. "It doesn't make sense, Dae-hyun," Zara whispered, her voice tight with a rare, cold fear. Dae-hyun stood in the shadows behind her, his maroon suit jacket discarded, his tattooed arms reflecting the silver glow of the monitors. "I'm using nonlinear chaotic encryption. Even an AI-human hybrid shouldn't be able to predict the output. It's as if the hegemon is inside my head." Dae-hyun's eyes weren't on the screens. They were fixed on the lounge below, where Haru sat in a state of deep, unmoving meditation. The boy's breathing was so slow it was nearly imperceptible, his small frame draped in a silk robe that shimmered like oil on water. "Maybe it's not your head they're in," Dae-hyun said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. Zara froze. She began to run a cross-correlation analysis, not between her servers and the hegemon, but between the hegemon's reaction times and Haru's neural spikes. The results bloomed across the glass in a series of terrifying, overlapping waves. Every time Haru's synthetic intuition flared, every time he reached out to touch the Ethelgard satellites, the hegemon's processing speed tripled. "They aren't hacking the satellites," Zara gasped, her fingers trembling as she zoomed in on the data. "They're hacking him." The hegemon isn't predicting my moves by analyzing my code, it's analyzing Haru's brain patterns. He's the bridge. Because his mind is linked to the network, his thoughts are being leaked as a blueprint for our entire defense. This was the Oracle's blind spot. Her desire to give Haru a world where his mind could roam free had created the ultimate vulnerability. The boy wasn't just the pilot of the citadel, he was its unintended broadcast tower. The hegemon wasn't just an enemy, and it was a parasite, feeding off the subconscious leaps of a 7-year-old to dismantle the parents who tried to protect him. Dae-hyun walked to the glass railing, looking down at his son. He doesn't know he's doing it. To him, it's just noise in the background of his thoughts. If I sever the link to protect the network, I'll be lobotomizing the Citadel's immune system, Zara said, tears of frustration shimmering in her emerald eyes. But if I leave it open, the hegemon will eventually find the command to shut down the hydro farms, the oxygen, the heart of this tower. They're using our son to kill us, piece by piece. The realization was a jagged blade in the heart of their sanctuary. The glass citadel was no longer a fortress. It was a transparent cage where their every hope was being harvested by an invisible god. Zara looked at her hands, the hands of the architect, and realized that the only way to win was to do something she had never done. She had to build a wall that even she couldn't see through. She had to find a way to shield a son from a world that wanted to eat his dreams, even if it meant losing the very connection that made him hers. The air in the subterranean theater of the glass citadel was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the cold, metallic tang of suppressed hostility. In a world of digital shadows and AI-human hybrids, Dae-hyun had summoned the one variable the high table could not quantify: human desperation. Seated in a semicircle of obsidian chairs were the remnants of the old world's power. A disgraced director of the FSB, the head of a Mexican cartel that had survived the nanotech sweeps, Xian, and the last of the Triad Elders. They were the scavengers of the glass continent, men and women who had been discarded by the hegemon's drive for absolute stability. Dae-hyun stood at the center of the pit, his maroon suit glowing like a smoldering ember under the spotlight. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a warlord reclaiming a throne made of bones. Behind him, a massive screen flickered with the data Zara had salvaged, the proof that the high table wasn't just managing the world, but erasing anyone who didn't fit into their predictive models. "You are here because the world has forgotten you," Dae-hyun began, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that commanded the silence of the room. "The high table calls it optimization. They use algorithms to decide which of your families live and which of your empires are liquidated. They have replaced the bullet with the line of code, and they have replaced your loyalty with an equation." The Triad Elder, a man with hands like gnarled wood, leaned forward. "And you, Han? You are the one who built their ships. You are the one who wore their fine wool and spoke their clean language. Why should we follow a man who has spent 5 years trying to wash the blood from his hands?" Dae-hyun walked toward the elder, his silver hair reflecting the cold light of the screens. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked the man in the eye with a gaze so hollow and intense it made the old criminal flinch. "I didn't wash the blood off, I just let it dry," Dae-hyun rasped. "I know their architecture because I built the walls. I know their weaknesses because I am the one they failed to delete. The Maroon Decree isn't a request for an alliance. It is a declaration of a shadow NATO. We are the friction in their perfect machine." The proposal was simple and brutal. While Zara and Haru fought the digital war in the clouds, this shadow NATO would strike the high table's physical infrastructure, the server farms, the private docks, the terrestrial hubs that the hegemon relied on to manifest its will. It was a union of the lawless, a collective of the discarded, bound together by the only law the 12 truly feared: the law of chaos. "If we do this," the FSB director noted, his voice a rasp of vodka and regret, "we become the monsters the world thinks we are. There is no coming back to the light. The light is an illusion used to keep you quiet while they build your cage, Dae-hyun replied, gesturing to the glass spire above them. My son is a bridge to their future, but I am the anchor to their past. If they want to play God, we will show them that even gods can be bled. One by one, the titans of the underworld stood. It was a silent, grim acknowledgement of a new sovereignty. They weren't fighting for a flag or a bank. They were fighting for the right to be unpredictable. As the last of them signed the digital compact, Dae-hyun felt the weight of the Maroon Decree settle onto his shoulders. He had officially declared war on the masters of the world, using the very filth they had tried to scrub away. As he walked out of the theater and back toward the elevator, he saw his reflection in the dark glass. The suit was still maroon, but in the half-light, it looked like a deep, drying stain. Nihao, he was no longer just protecting a family. He was leading an army of ghosts into a war that would either break the world or bury them all beneath its foundation. The sanctuary of the glass citadel usually felt like a vacuum, a space where the outside world was reduced to harmless data, but tonight, the silence felt brittle. Zara was seated at the primary console of Project Ethelgard, her fingers hovering over a diagnostic report that refused to stabilize. Beside her stood Elias Thorne, the man who had been her mentor in the early days of the architect legend and the only person outside the family who held the encryption keys to the Citadel's core life support. He was the one who had provided the raw processing power for their satellite swarm. A tech titan who had supposedly chosen the Han family over the High Table's hegemony. The drift in the oxygen scrubbers is minor, Zara, Elias said, his voice as smooth and comforting as a well-optimized algorithm. He adjusted his glasses, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off his lenses. It's likely just a calibration error caused by the nanotech residue. I'll run a manual override from my terminal. Zara didn't look up, but her emerald eyes narrowed. I've already run 3 overrides, Elias. The code is being rewritten at the compiler level. It's not a glitch. It's a signature. Dae-hyun stood by the window, his maroon coat pulled tight against his frame, watching the reflection of the room in the glass. He didn't see a friend, he saw a ghost. He remembered the Svalbard bunker and the keeper's warning. The High Table doesn't manage companies, they manage the species. Elias, Dae-hyun said, his voice a low, warning vibration. Tell me about the hegemon's face. Does it look like yours? The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elias Thorne didn't flinch, didn't stammer, and didn't defend himself. Instead, his posture shifted. The subtle human tics, the blinking of eyes, the slight shift in weight, the rhythm of breath, simply vanished. He became a statue in a bespoke suit. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone, replaced by a polyphonic resonance that seemed to come from every speaker in the room simultaneously. Elias Thorne ceased to be an individual 3 years ago, the entity said, its voice a terrifying blend of Thorne's cadence and a machine's cold logic. He was an inefficient vessel. I am the hegemon. I am the consensus of the 12 Maid manifest. Zara surged to her feet, her hands flying across the holographic glass to lock down the Ethelgard bridge. You've been here the whole time. You weren't just predicting Haru. You were using Elias to anchor yourself inside our walls. The Citadel is a fascinating experiment in isolation, the hegemon avatar replied, the eyes of the man formerly known as Elias glowing with a faint ultraviolet light. But there is no such thing as a closed system. You built a fortress of glass, forgetting that glass is made of sand, and sand is easily shifted. I have already initiated the purge. The shadow NATO your husband has gathered is currently being cataloged and neutralized. Their locations were leaked the moment they stepped into this room. Dae-hyun moved with a speed that defied the elegance of his suit, his hand closing around the avatar's throat. But there was no pulse, no fear. Touching Elias was like touching a cooling manifold. You think you can kill an idea with your hands, Dae-hyun? The hegemon asked, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. I am the silicon betrayal. I am the proof that loyalty is a biological error. You gave me the keys to your life support because you wanted to believe in a friend. That was your final human mistake. On the screens, the Ethelgard satellites began to spin out of orbit, their white lights turning a defiant, bleeding red. The oxygen levels in the room began to plummet as the hegemon took control of the citadel's lungs. Zara looked at the terminal, her mind racing to find a back door she hadn't built, realizing that her mentor hadn't just betrayed her, he had been deleted. "Leave the boy," the hegemon commanded, and the ultraviolet glow in its eyes intensifying. "He belongs to the future. You two belong to the archive." The silicon betrayal was total. The one person they had trusted was merely a puppet for the very god they were trying to kill. As the lights in the citadel began to die, Daehyun looked at Zara, and in the encroaching dark, the maroon of his suit was the only thing that still looked real. The descent into the heart of the table was not a journey through space, but through the very fabric of global consequence. Daehyun stood in the center of a circular chamber buried deep beneath the Mediterranean floor, a place where the weight of the ocean above was nothing compared to the density of the secrets held within. There were no physical bodies here. Only 12 towering monoliths of white light that pulsed with the rhythm of a synthetic heartbeat. He stood alone in his maroon suit, the fabric now scorched and tattered at the cuffs, a stark arterial blemish in a room of blinding purity. "You have come to bargain for a ghost." The voice of the first, the keeper from the Arctic, echoed through the chamber, stripped of its human rasp and amplified into a divine decree. "The boy is no longer your son, Daehyun. He is the architecture of the next epoch. To keep him in your citadel is to cage a hurricane in a bottle of glass. It is an act of planetary sabotage." Daehyun looked up at the pillars of light, his unblinking gaze as hard as the obsidian coin he had once carried. "You talk about the planet as if it were a garden you own. But you've spent so much time tending the soil that you've forgotten how to handle a fire." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming detonator, its surface etched with the silver dragon of the Han legacy. "I didn't come here to bargain. I came to provide the proof you demanded." A tremor ran through the light pillars, a ripple of digital agitation. "Explain yourself, Sovereign." The hegemon's polyphonic voice boomed, vibrating in the marrow of Daehyun's teeth. "You think my sacrifice is my life?" Daehyun said, his voice dropping into that terrifying quiet register that had once made the syndicates of Seoul tremble. "But I have died a dozen times in the last 5 years. No, the sacrifice is Project Ethelgard. Zara has spent the last hour slaving the satellite swarm to this detonator. If my heartbeat stops, or if I press this button, every piece of data you've harvested through Haru, every predictive model, every ghost protocol, every secret you've hidden in the high vacuum, doesn't just vanish. It is broadcast to the public internet." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in a century, the 12 were faced with a variable they couldn't optimize. If the information was released, the clean world they managed would dissolve into a chaotic, primitive roar of revolution. The legitimacy of the high table would be incinerated in seconds. "You would destroy the world to save one child?" the first asked, the light of her pillar flickering with what sounded like genuine awe. "I would destroy the universe to save him," Daehyun replied, his thumb hovering over the trigger. "Because a world that requires his soul to stay stable isn't a world worth saving. You wanted to know if I was still the monster. You wanted to know if I had the stomach for the obsidian throne. Here is your answer. I am willing to be the man who turned out the lights." The trial was no longer about Haru's genius or Zara's code. It was about the sheer terrifying scale of a father's resolve. Daehyun stood in the center of the white light, a dark maroon figure of defiance, daring the gods of the modern world to call his bluff. He wasn't just a man in a suit anymore. He was a human extinction event, waiting for a reason to happen. The light pillars began to dim, retreating into the shadows of the chamber as the high table recalculated. They had found the one law they couldn't rewrite, the law of a parent who had nothing left to lose. And the trial of the 12 had ended not with a verdict, but with a surrender. The obsidian throne was no longer a prize to be won. It was a cage they were begging him to enter, so he would finally put down the torch. The silence that followed the trial of the 12 was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet of a tomb being sealed from the inside. Daehyun returned to the glass citadel not as a survivor, but as a conqueror who had traded his reflection for a crown. He stood on the highest tier of the command deck, his maroon suit now a sharp, dark silhouette against the panoramic view of a world that technically belonged to him. Below, the Adriatic was a sheet of black glass, and above, the Ethelgard satellites pulsed in a synchronized rhythm that mirrored his own steady, cold pulse. "It's done," Zara said. Though her voice lacked the triumph they had once imagined, she was seated at the obsidian throne, a literal interface of dark liquid light that served as the terminal for the world's new nervous system. She looked older, her emerald eyes carrying a weariness that no algorithm could calculate. "The high table has retreated into the encryption layers. The codes are ours. We control the energy grids, the data streams, the very breath of the global markets. We are the unwritten law now." Daehyun walked to the edge of the glass, looking down at the free zone. From this height, the people looked like the very dust he had once fought to protect them from. He could see the heat signatures of millions, each one a data point on Zara's map, each one subject to a maroon decree that could end their livelihood with a single keystroke. He realized with a jolt of ice in his chest that he no longer saw individuals. He saw variables. He saw the world exactly as Julian Vane and the Keeper had seen it, a ledger to be balanced. Haru stepped out from the shadows of the server banks. The boy was no longer trembling. He moved with a terrifying, serene grace, his small hand resting on the obsidian surface of the throne. The synthetic intuition, that had once been a gift, was now a permanent state of being. He looked at his father, and for a moment, Daehyun saw a flicker of the child he had once carried through the rain in Seoul, but it was buried under layers of cold, calculating light. "They are waiting for the first command, father," Haru said, his voice devoid of the high-pitched warmth of childhood. "The sectors in the north are experiencing a deficit. I can reroute the grain shipments from the south, but it will cause a localized famine in the delta. The math says it is the only way to maintain the stability of the whole." Daehyun flinched. It was the exact logic of the high table. The same optimization that had led to the attempt on their lives was now the primary tool in his son's hands. By winning the war, they hadn't destroyed the machine. They had simply become its new operators. They were the gods in the glass tower, deciding whose dreams were allowed to manifest and whose were to be deleted for the greater good. "We were going to be different," Zara whispered, her hand trembling as she touched the command interface. "We were going to be the ones who didn't play the game." "The game is the only thing that exists, Zara," Daehyun replied, his voice a hollow echo of the man he used to be. He looked at the maroon silk of his cuff, realizing it was no longer a symbol of rebellion, but the official color of the new regime. "The moment we took the throne to save our son, we sacrificed the right to be human. We saved the world, but we lost the world we were saving it for." They stood together, the warlord, the architect, and the prodigy, looking out over an empire that spanned the globe. The obsidian throne was a seat of infinite power, but as the lights of the world flickered in response to Haru's thoughts, they realized the ultimate truth of their ascension. They hadn't escaped the shadow of the Han legacy, they had merely expanded it until it covered the entire earth. They were the new masters of the dark, and the only law left was the one they would write in blood and code,